We're continuing part 2 of reading Walden from the analysis of a scholar of Thoreau, page 352. Thoreau the person really did want to change our lives, or at least make us confront the conditions of our lives, and if we cannot change those conditions, realize the extent to which the fault is our own. But by the midpoint of Walden, Thoreau, the narrator, has thus far changed nothing. The reader, just like the fields, gapes at him in an uncomprehending rapture, then goes on exactly as before, selling their life to buy a few consumer trinkets. Do you think that we're awestruck by Thoreau while reading it? And then we just go shopping. Forget about it. We won't feel some rapture reading. I feel we felt rapture, but later today we're just going to go shopping for consumer goods. Then go on exactly as before, selling their lives to buy a few consumer trinkets. If Thoreau cannot persuade the desperate and hungry fields face to face with their house at his back and all Walden before, how can he hope to persuade the reader so far in the future like us? His house a ruin and Walden gone at this moment. Thoreau's great book is, by his own account, a failure. Is his book a failure or not? It's not a failure. If it doesn't change anybody, how could it not be a failure? Thoreau's charity consisted literally of trying to teach John Fields to fish. But as Walden's narrator returns home with his own string of fish, he is filled with shame for craving animal food. What follows is higher laws, a queasy self-examination of the killing his appetite demands. This is the chapter that sent Thoreau to Chassuncook to witness George Thatcher's moose hunt. He anatomized the reality of this violence in Chassuncook, but in Walden he wrote instead, as a tortured Puritan compelled to put down beastly appetites. Do you feel I'm a tortured Puritan? Nature is hard to be overcome, but she must be overcome. Quote, nature is hard to overcome, but she must be overcome. Unquote. Those very words made Thoreau pull back from his prudery in dismay, ashamed of his own shame. If we really revered human nature, would we not, like the Hindu lawgiver, simply speak openly of our bodily functions of, quote, how to eat, drink, cohabitate, void excrement and urine, and the like, unquote. Instead of fighting to, quote, overcome, unquote, our bodily nature, we should accept and redeem it. And so Thoreau closed this chapter, the turning point of his book, by staging himself a second time, this time as, quote, John Farmer, unquote, sitting on the threshold one September evening. That is what we are seeing. When we see Thoreau within the pages of Walden, it's not the author who so carefully staged the book, but the book's protagonist, who, in the course of the year and the day, is utterly changed by the experience. John Farmer. Are you born a farmer? Are you a farmer? John Farmer, the next stage in this metamorphosis, yearns for rest while his mind natters on with plans and contrivances for the next day's work. The notes of a distant flute reach his ears, but half heard and dismissed, quote, out of a different sphere from that he worked in. unquote, until gently they do away with sweet and village and state, asking him to come out of this, quote, mean, moiling life, unquote. But how? Quote, all that he could think of was to practice some new austerity, to let his mind descend into his body and redeem it, and treat himself with ever-increasing respect, unquote. It is at least a beginning. You feel he's beginning to listen to the music of the spheres. Quote, brute neighbors, unquote, completes the turn. Thoreau opened it with yet a third mocking self-portrait, this time as the navel-gazing, quote, hermit, unquote, interrupted by the, quote, poet, unquote, a sprightly Ellery Channing with his faithful dog who jollies the hermit out of his involuted thoughts to come along fishing. In a flash, the hectoring and self-consumed philosopher transforms into the lyric poet himself, the neighborhood Orpheus who's asked as he sets off for the river, fishing pole in hand, quote, why do precisely these objects which we behold make a world, unquote. The beholding that follows begins with the little wild moose who sits on his mouse, with the little wild mouse, not moose, with the little wild mouse who sits on his palm nibbling cheese from his fingers and extends ever outward, peopling Walden woods with life not his own, most of it not even human, an unseen world conjured into being. As Thoreau reminded himself, quote, poetry implies the whole truth. Philosophy expresses a part of it. Bending Walden towards the cycle of rebirth meant opening it to seasonal change in the ways that living in season alters the rhythm of living and thinking. As winter drives life, quote, into a corner. During winter is our life driven into a corner. It proves not mean, but rich and warm. Is our life rich and warm in the winter? The narrator surrounds his hearth with visitors, including the freed slaves and impoverished laborers whose circle he has joined, and the brute neighbors who shelter beside him. Like the wasp, he accepts until they disappear into the cracks. The human, quote, economy, unquote, of his first chapter thus enlarges to a new concept, not, quote, economia, unquote, or management of the household, but, quote, ecologia, ecology. He's become an ecologist. The speaking of the household composed of 1,000 voices, mice and wasps, rabbits and squirrels, jays and chickadees, and also his human friends. Bronson, Olcott, Ellery Channing, Edmund Hosmer, and with the chill Ralph Waldo Emerson. The closest Thoreau came to meeting Greeley's request for sketches of his famous friends. Walden Pond itself, iced over now, catches his surveyor's eye, so the narrator literally takes the measure of this personality too, finding the long-lost bottom of the pond that will turn out, in the end, to be bottomless after all. Do you think that the Walden Pond was bottomless, or Walden is bottomless, or Thoreau's book is bottomless, or what's he mean like that? The amount you get from the book is infinite. Walden opens in spring with a fractured and furious narrator who can diagnose despair in others because he knows it so well in himself. And Ishmael, casting off into the world ocean of Walden, by the second spring the narrator is remade, ready and healed, whole and strong. The man who railed at the fields to change has instead changed himself, proceeded through a cycle of rebirths from philosopher through farmer and hermit to poet. The payoff of that initial uncomfortable encounter with the fields has finally begun. The conceit finally completed, with the poet integrating all that came before as the raw wound of the railroad's deep cut thaws and flows. He sees in the flowing sands the canvas of creation, revealing the great truth that we live not on the surface of a dead planet, but in and through a living earth, like a leaf unfolding as the pond whops and thaws into quick and simmering life. He sees the coming of cosmos out of chaos. A spiritual understanding so deep that he can even accept the grossness of a dead and rotting horse, death and sacrifice, not as the portrayal of nature's beauty, but the sign of a universal innocence that transgresses the limits of our lives, sublime, intimate, and terrible. The man who embraced the dying body of his brother admits the terrible truth that bodies, too, melt and flow like sand on the beach of Fire Island. The fables of rebirth Thoreau offered in his conclusion include his own Walden experiment. Time swept it away, to be resurrected by art. For more than 2 years, Thoreau dedicated himself to perfecting Walden, putting off everything else, refusing to compromise with time, and as he added the finishing strokes, it, quote, suddenly expanded before the eyes of the astonished artist into the fairest of all the creations of Brahma, unquote. On his title page, he emblazoned his motto, quote, I do not propose to write an ode to dejection, but to brag as lustfully as the chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up. And on his final page he greeted the eternal dawn with the chanticleer call. Quote, the light which puts out our eyes is darkness to us. Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star. He who midway through Walden had been arrested on the threshold of life is now himself the player on the flute, whose notes reach the ears of those who, hearing, might be released to begin their own journey towards the dawn. The ceremony enacted at Walden, and in Walden creates a kind of miracle, scripture written, as Emerson imagined, in our own time, by a man both in and out of time itself. That was reading Walden. Final quote is, the light which puts out our eyes is darkness to us. Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn. The sun is but a morning star. That's the closing line of Walden. Very good. Part 2 of Reading Walden. We closed that section on page 355. We are reading from Henry David Thoreau, Life.